First of all, thank you all for having me here. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here talking to realtors who are some of the real important people involved in doing land transactions, obviously, especially talk about forest land today. And I'll try and make this as relevant as possible to you all and talk about things that would be directly applicable that you as a realtor, if you're helping a client buy or sell a piece of land that has forest on it, what are all the things you could know, what are all the possible major financial advantage and incentives you have for things. So my contact info is on the screen there. Feel free to take a picture of this slide. I also have business cards out in the room here. And you want to pick up a business card, I'm more than happy to answer any questions you have afterwards. Feel free to call, email me, whatever. This is something I'm very passionate about. Love talking about forestry and getting more people involved and learning about it. So again, my name is Andy Tate. I'm the co-executive director and the forestry director at EcoForesters. And say a little bit about us. Get this forwarding. Let's see. I have to figure out, get out of this.
I think you just click on your slide on the background.
I'm looking at the, there we go. Okay. Yeah. So EcoForesters, we are a nonprofit professional forestry organization dedicated to conserving and restoring Appalachian forests. And we do this through educational events like this, telling folks about forestry work. And we actually do boots on the ground forestry work as well. Full range, we provide a full range of consulting forestry services, from doing consultations with people on their forest mapping services, write forest management plans for people, have people control non-native invasive plants on their property, do other forest stand improvement work to improve their forests, and also do sustainable timber harvest if a client wants to do a timber harvest, do that in a way that's sustainable and hopefully actually ecologically beneficial to things out there. So that's a little of our background there on things. So to get us started here, just a very quick 3-minute history of Southern Appalachian forestry. So the forests we have now, they're great, they're beautiful, they're wonderful. It's one of the major drivers of your industry. Why people come here and spend millions of dollars buying this land is because it's incredibly beautiful forests around here in the mountains. The scenery, the forests are incredibly valuable. Their value is well beyond the timber value. The recreational value is huge, billions of dollars. The real estate value is even more than that. So it's a huge, huge industry that is based on forest around here. The brewing industry is actually based on water quality, which comes from forest too as well. But the forests around here, 200 years ago or more, were actually much greater quality and much more diverse than they were now. Those pictures in the slide here are chestnut trees. And these were the redwoods of the East. 100 years ago, there were chestnut trees around here. It was the most common tree. 1 in 4 trees in the mountains was a chestnut. 8 feet in diameter. There are people in the picture being dwarfed by those trees. Huge, huge trees. Well, chestnut blight came through and wiped out 1/4 of the trees in just a blink of an eye, really ecologically. In 10 years' time, in the 30s and 40s, they're wiped out. So we've lost a major keystone species that was a great source of food for wildlife as well as the humans alike. We've gathered the chestnuts. The whole song, Christmas song, comes from that. That's a really iconic tree. It's really changed our forest dramatically out there. Also, it's great timber. It's incredibly rot resistant. There's still barns. You'll see barns, actually another valuable real estate piece. If you come across an old barn on a property, a lot of times those old tobacco barns are made of chestnut wood, and that old lumber will last forever. And it's actually very valuable. So if you have an old chestnut barn on a property, that's something that can be valuable as well. So keep that in mind. So another thing that happened here, sometime around the turn of the 1900s, huge wave of industrial logging went through, and essentially 85% of Southern was clear cut. This wasn't, forestry or forest management. This was just, let's cut the material down and get it out of here as fast as possible. Left whole mountainsides bare. It was terrible. There was erosion, lots of ecological damage, not done well at all. But that's what was here happened within the past 100, 150 years. So basically, there are hardly any trees that are 100 years or 150 years old or more around here. We have much younger forests now because of this massive clear cutting that happened. And that's had a major impact on our forest as well. So, and a lot of the forests that weren't cut back then, you know where they were? The very top of the mountain, where it was really steep and rocky, and the trees didn't really grow very well anyways. They didn't have any value. So it wasn't like the great big trees that were left. It was a lot of times it was these little rocky high outcrops that were left. So that was really changed things as well. That wasn't very popular, all that clear cutting. So for the past 100 years, one of the most common practices and still being used today by a lot of people in the woods, unfortunately. A lot of loggers, traditional loggers and in the mills will go out and do what they call a high grade cut. It's often euphemistically called a selective cut, where they're selecting the biggest and the best trees, ones that have the most value, and just cutting those trees, taking those trees to the mill and leaving the smaller, poorly formed, less desirable, less healthy trees behind. And this has degraded our forests. This happened sometimes 2 or even occasionally 3 times on a property where they keep doing this, removing the best, leaving the rest. And it really is a removal of the best, the opposite of evolution. So our forests have been degraded in quality and also less diverse because they're taking out just the trees that they really want for value and not looking. This is not sustainable. This is not forestry. This is not sustainable. That's one of the big problems we have now is we have much lower quality forests, even though we're here 100 years ago. Things came back. It's amazing. You think about that clear cutting in the last slide there, the forests around, you look, they're beautiful, they're incredible. The forests can come back if they're managed well. And the clear cut, if it's done properly, actually, the forest can come back. Lots of little trees will come in, they'll grow, they'll compete, and it'll be a healthy forest. It'll take decades, but they can come back. They don't come back from this very well, unfortunately. So that's changed things a little bit. So again, here we are. It's hard to believe what you're looking at here. This is all stuff that was all clear cut, roughly 100 years ago. And sometimes it's been high graded since then, which still isn't looking pretty good because they're still leaving some trees out there. But sometimes the trees out there aren't as healthy as they should be, or as they could be, certainly. Not as much diversity. And there's not as much structural diversity. This is beautiful out here. It really is beautiful. But if you look underneath it here, all that green mixed in there are non-native invasive plants. Right? There are things like kudzu out there. Sometimes things that are the greenest and the densest are actually the least healthy out there for things. Other thing is, it was all cut 100 years ago, maybe 100 years ago maximum. There's very little old growth out there left. Most of those forests that come back are what they call middle-aged forests now, between 60 to maybe 100 years old, which is middle-aged for a forest because trees can live 200 years or more within the species. So these forests are very middle-aged, and it's not what a forest ideally wants to be. In a true old growth forest, somewhere around 1 to 2% of the trees would naturally die, fall over, and a big tree falls over and create an opening, maybe an acre or 2 in the forest, knock over a couple of trees, a domino effect. And there'd be some disturbance out there and then open up and then young trees would come in. So an old growth forest isn't all big trees. Those big trees do die and fall over and young trees then come to replace them. And so there's all different sizes and ages of trees in a true old growth forest out there. Also things like wind and ice come through. And fire used to be a regular part of our landscape. The Native Americans burned for thousands of years, and it really benefited the forest. Oaks in particular really benefited, and they're fire tolerant, and they actually increased. And that's probably the most desirable tree now for wildlife as well as for timber. Oaks, I'll talk more about oaks, but oaks are the keystone wildlife tree. Not just the acorns they produce, everything from birds to bears eats the acorns, but 500 species of different caterpillars live on oak trees. And those big, fat, juicy caterpillars, birds love them. And if you go around an oak tree or an oak forest, there's going to be a higher diversity and concentration of wildlife around an oak tree. So managing for oak is really important. But what has happened in our forests is because we have this pretty even-aged forest, middle-aged forest with a continuous canopy, underneath that it's shadier and moister, and oaks like it drier and sunnier. So the oaks are not regenerating, and things like maples and birches and beeches and rhododendron have really expanded and are much more prevalent than they were 100 years ago. So the forests are changing in a composition that's not in a beneficial way for wildlife. It's also not beneficial for climate change because things are going to get drier and hotter. Oaks are also more adaptable to drought and heat, and also more fire resistant. Fire could be part of that hotter and drier future we have probably coming for us with climate change. So all these things here, it looks beautiful, but look closer underneath it there's some issues going on. So we have a need to restore forests. My dad used to say he managed by benign neglect. I mean, just do nothing, let the forest take care of itself. Nature would take care of itself and heal itself. Unfortunately, that's not true anymore. Things like climate change, non-native invasive plants that were introduced by humans, all these things that happened, fire suppression for the past 100 years by humans have really changed the forest. And things like oaks are not regenerating. So you have these big patches of kudzu that, are obviously not a natural thing. If you do nothing, that kudzu patch is not going to go away. It's going to grow, get bigger, and get worse. Invasive plants, if you have invasive plants, you don't control them, they will get worse. It will damage the forest further. Same thing with a lot of native insects. There's the hemlock woolly adelgid there in the lower left-hand corner, those little tiny cotton balls. So we lost our chestnut trees to the chestnut blight. We lost our American elm trees to the Dutch elm disease. We've now lost 90% of our hemlocks to hemlock woolly adelgid. We're now losing, or already have lost, our ash trees to the emerald ash borer. All these are non-native invasive insects that came over often in packing materials from Asia and have wiped out 4 or 5 species essentially are gone from our landscape that used to be here because of these things. We have to take some actions to help mitigate these things here. What are the problems? What are the reasons people don't do more to take care of their forests? The number one thing is it costs money to manage a forest well, usually, because you have to restore and kind of mitigate some of these damages that have been done in the past. So you oftentimes have to invest some money in the forest initially to get it back to a good state, where then hopefully it could become profitable in the future. But non-native invasive plants, that picture in the lower left there, that's all that green, solid wall green. Nothing in there you can see is native. That's Asiatic bittersweet, probably the worst invasive plant around here. It's a vine that climbs up, twines up trees, produces lots of red berries this time of year. People like looks pretty, which by the way, for ornamental reasons. It actually can grow over the top of a mature tree in the middle of a shady forest. It's shade tolerant, grows up over the top of it, and the vines then can actually, the weight of the vines can pull down and kill the tree and actually wipe out whole acres of forest. So that's one that can really cause damage. If you have lots of vines in your forest, something you really got to watch out for. And tree of heaven there is another one, really nasty plant, emits a chemical from its roots that inhibits other plants from growing. So it gives a competitive advantage, and it spreads by the roots, and one tree can become 10 trees, can become 100 trees. And I've seen, again, acres of forest that are nothing but this non-native tree of heaven that's just spread and taken over after some kind of disturbance happened. Any kind of disturbance, especially land disturbance, is an opening where invasive plants can come in very quickly and quickly outgrow the native plants. So talk about climate change. We have to prepare our forests for a hotter, drier, possibly more fires in the future. We have less diversity of species. A lot of times after clear cuts, nothing but poplars came back in, so you have whole forests full of poplars. It's a native tree, a valuable tree, but it's not the most diverse forest to have a giant stand of poplars, or people planted big pine plantations. And again, a lot less diversity in the pine plantation, a lot less valuable wildlife habitat. And it's also susceptible to health issues. If you have an insect that comes in that likes pine trees or likes poplars, that stand that's less diverse is less healthy as well. And the last thing is, a lot of times people say, oh, I want to do a timber harvest so I can get some funds to manage my forest. I said, great. I go out there, look at the property, and I tell them, well, you really don't have much or any timber value here because of that past high grading where all the valuable trees have been cut out of the forest and it's left behind the trees that grew slower and weren't as healthy, weren't as vigorous, didn't have as good genetics, or weren't adapted to the site. We often have less valuable forest, so that there's not as much possibility to even do a sustainable timber harvest to gain some revenue. That's another issue that goes on there. That's to look at a high graded stand at the bottom right hand there. They just left behind some smaller, poorly formed trees, and they cut the big trees down. It often damages the smaller trees too. So you're left behind, but again, trees that were poor and unhealthy and didn't grow as fast, and now they're getting damaged by the bigger trees being cut around them. So it leaves some trees there. It looks better to the untrained eye, but it actually is a much less valuable forest. Might be better to actually cut all those trees. So change gears. What can we do about it? What can you all do about it? What are some things to be aware of if you're involved in buying or selling forest land? This is the part I think you'll find really interesting. There's a lot of options here to help you financially and to make good decisions for you and your clients. So one thing we offer is a forest land assessment for people. There we go. Thank you. And I can see, yeah. And if you ever want these slides, I'm happy to email these slides out to anyone that wants them afterwards. So feel free to reach out to me and give you all the content and resources as well for things. So yeah, one really important thing. We actually did as an example here. It's like when you buy a house, what does the client have to do? The buyer. They have to do a home inspection to see if there's any issues in the house before they buy the house. There's no requirement for forest land for that, but I highly recommend that you have a trained forester come out there, whether it's me or someone else, come out there and do an assessment for your client who's buying this property to let them know, are there some issues here in the property they should be aware of? So they're aware of what they're getting into. This is actually an example for a client we did, and I'll go ahead and mention Pat here. This is a client of Pat's. Pat is on our board of directors, by the way. He's a realtor for National Land Realty. He's on the board of directors of EcoForesters. And he had a client that was buying a property and he wanted us to assess it for them. We went out there and looked at it, and the property was really overrun with invasives. So hopefully you might know some invasives and be aware of. So you see a lot of vines in the trees. Maybe that's something to have checked out by a forester. So we went out there, spent a day out there, observed the property, and it was bad. There was just vines 3 and 4 inches big climbing up the trees, all kinds of rose bushes and thickets of other non-native trees. The tree of heaven was there, the princess tree was there, all these non-native invasive plants. It's right on the edge of Asheville. In general, the closer you are to town or development, the more disturbance there's been, the more introduction of invasive plants there's been. They're probably going to spread to those areas that are more developed. The farther away from development you get, the less risky it is. But this property, we estimated would cost almost $200,000 to treat these invasive plants, to control them, so that the forest would actually stay as a forest and not be completely destroyed. If nothing happened on this property, this forest would have been wiped out. It was that bad. I mean, it's going to cost, it's a lot of money to go in there and cut down all these vines. It usually involves some herbicide, at least on the stump, to stop the vine from resprouting. It's a lot of work, a lot of time. It's manual labor. It's done. We have crews who out there and do this all the time. And this client was able to negotiate, hey, it's going to cost $200,000 to keep this property healthy, to make this a safe forest for the future. Essentially, they're going to negotiate that off the price. That's a significant cost savings. So doing some kind of assessment before you buy it is really important. Have a professional look at it, just see what's going on. It's a pretty small fee for doing this. We can be a couple $100s for a small property, maybe $1,000 for a bigger property. It's not a huge expense. And if you're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars or maybe millions of dollars on big properties, it's well worth it to know what you're getting into on things. So that's one thing we can do for you. I can get this thing to advance now. I'm not sure where to point it at. And then to go back somewhere else to get to advance. It was advancing before, now it's not advancing. Yeah, nothing out here. Okay. Another one step up from that, beyond a basic assessment, looking at the health of the forest, we can also do a timber appraisal. You can have a forester do a timber appraisal for you. This is a much more detailed inventory of species, sizes of trees, and look at to estimate the actual value of the timber on the property. And this can influence the buying or selling price of a property too. It can be significant value. It can be a couple $1,000s per acre, perhaps, of timber value on there. And it's important information to have if you do want to do a timber sale in the future as well. And finally, if you do have this done at the time that you buy the property, when you buy the property, you're also buying the timber. And if you sell the timber, just like selling a stock, you only have to pay taxes on the profit you make from it. So when you bought the property, you're buying the timber. So you can have the timber assessed when you buy the property. You only have to pay taxes if you do a timber sale on the profit you made since you bought the property. If you had that timber basis done to establish your basis when you bought the property, what the value of the timber was then, it's only what has grown and increased in value since then that you have to pay taxes on. And there's just some sample prices we had on there for something. That's a timber appraisal, a little more in depth here. But again, the problem to all of this, number one barrier is money. So let's talk about money. What are some things you can do as a realtor to save your clients a ton of money? And to do this, the main thing you have to have some kind of forest management or forest stewardship plan. It's something that I can do for you or any other registered forester can do for you. Prepare a plan, tells you, assesses the current state of the forest, talks to the owner about their goals for the forest, and then makes a plan to help you reach your goals. If you have these goals, you can get a major tax break through what's called the North Carolina Forestry Present Use Value Program, or PUV. You can get major tax savings from that. You also can get funding from the USDA, Forestry falls under agriculture, or from the North Carolina Forest Service to do this work as well. They'll at least do a cost share funding. They'll pay part of the cost for doing some of this work to control invasive plants or improve your forest in other ways to help people be able to afford it, because people just can't afford to do this work sometimes. Some people can, some people can't. And you can also do timber sales for things. So we'll talk about these in detail. The first one probably of most interest to you, North Carolina Forestry Present Use Value Program. And this basically taxes property on how you are using the property, not taxing it on its highest and best use, which is the standard assessment for all properties around here. So even bare, empty forest land around here, most in Buncombe County or most of the surrounding counties, is taxed at about $10,000. The tax value is about $10,000 per acre. It can sell for a lot more than that sometimes, but the tax value is about $10,000 per acre. That's what you could make if you develop the property, put houses on the property, put in roads, put in, some kind of recreational venue, Airbnb or whatever, zip lines, all those things. You could develop that property and then it'd be worth that much money. But if you're just managing it for forestry, you can't make that much money off just timber per year. The most you can make off timber is probably about less than $500 per acre per year. It's not a especially lucrative investment in timber, just why that there's no more timber companies around here. It used to be 30, 40, probably 50 years ago in the 80s, there were timber companies that owned thousands of acres in here because land was a couple $100s an acre and they could make more than that on the timber invested. Now the land is worth more for other uses than it is for timber. So the timber company all sold their land here decades ago. And it's now being bought and sold by you and your clients now because it's much more valuable for other things. But because if you declare you're using it for forestry, it'll reduce the tax to about $500 an acre or less, usually between $200 and $400 per acre is what they'll assess the taxes at, versus, again, $10,000 per acre in Buncombe County, probably the same in Henderson County, probably the same in Transylvania, probably the same in Jackson County. It's a little bit less in some of the more remote rural counties, but in the counties that have high demand, it can be very expensive. So if you go from $10,000 an acre in assessment value to 500 or less, it's a 95% tax savings in these highly desirable areas. It's not as much if you're go down in the Piedmont to areas like Rutherford County, McDowell County, may not be quite as much down there, but it's still going to be at least 60% tax savings for having this property in this forestry present use value program. So to qualify for this, some things you have to have. One, you have to have at least 20 acres of forest. It does not include house sites, does not include lawns or gardens or anything landscape. It has to be forests that are managed as forests. And you have to have a plan. And part of the plan does have to involve timber harvesting. That is one of the requirements for the forestry present use value program is timber harvesting. That has to be part of the plan. You do not have to clear cut your property. EcoForester specializes in ecological forestry and even ecological timber harvesting, where you can do timber harvesting that can actually improve the quality and diversity of your forest. And you can do improvement work as well. But you can be in this program and just doing the improvement work, preparing for a future harvest. A lot of times forests aren't ready to be harvested. People want to do a timber harvest and they call me up and I say, no, it's not really ready yet. You have to wait 10, 20, 30 years sometimes. You can only harvest usually at most once every 30 or 40 years around here, oftentimes 50 or 60. If it's an oak stand, it can be 70 or 80 years between harvests. So it can be a long rotation between timber harvests out there. But you have to have a plan. It has to be a current plan, it has to be approved by a forester into this program. And you have to apply to the county to go through all that stuff too. A couple other things, you have to either live on the property or have owned it for 4 years to qualify. There also is an exception to that. However, if the previous owner had it in the forestry present use value program and your client's buying it, they have the option to keep it in the forestry present use value program and keep that major tax break, which can be a big benefit to both the buyer and of course the seller. Can make it easier to sell it. They can advertise, oh, it's selling it, and it's selling as a very low taxable property because of that use value on the property. And we'll talk more about the transfer process a little bit up here. That'll be obviously very relevant to you all. So if the property is owned by individuals, it's no problem. They can qualify for this program. They can do what they want with it. If it's owned by a private business, an LLC or incorporated, something like that, the business can only qualify, one, if it's a private business. This can't be a publicly traded company. They don't qualify for this. Or if that business declares forestry as their primary business, which you actually have to do to the Secretary of State online, you file your business papers. So if you happen to own like a real estate investment company that buys land and then sells land, your main business is real estate investment. It's not forestry, so you wouldn't qualify for that. But if you have a lot of people have an LLC just designed to own the property with, and it's fine if an LLC, which you just created just so you could own the property for tax benefits or for inheritance or various things you wanted to create an LLC, a different ownership structure. If it just owns that property, then you can say, okay, and I'm owning this property for forestry. You can change, you can make that that primary business is forestry, and they then qualify for this program here. But you have to have it.
Question.
Yeah.
Did that law change in the last couple of years? Because it came up more recent. I've seen it in the last 2 or 3 years, which I never felt. And maybe I'm wondering if some of the people closing the deals didn't know prior to that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, the law has not changed. Written in the 70s. The law was written in the 70s. It's not changed, but the law is enforced by the county tax assessors. And it varies greatly from county to county, how strictly they enforce it. In general, the higher the tax values, the more strictly it gets enforced because they're losing millions of dollars in taxes through this. So yeah, Buncombe County, again, Henderson County, Jackson County, I know enforce it very heavily because there's very high land values there. More rural counties, it's not as enforced as vigorously, but the law has not changed. There's still the requirements of law as it was spelled out, it hasn't changed anything on there. But yeah, these are all things you should be aware of as the way it is. Even if it's not enforced, that's still the law. You should be aware of that because they could come in and enforce it at any point in time. Last point, it's a voluntary program. Someone can sign up for it and be in it as long as they want. If they change their mind and want to get out of the program, they can do that. They do have to then repay 3 years of back tax savings, whatever they saved over the past 3 years, but just the past 3 years, they have to pay back those taxes. It can be significant, it can be thousands of dollars in tax savings that they have to repay. But if they've been in the program for 4 or more years, it's only the last 3 you have to repay. Been in it for longer than that, you've gotten permanent tax savings for the years prior to that. But really it's designed for people that want to manage forests and manage them long-term, which is why they have this waiting period of 4 years, unless you live on the property or unless the previous owner had it and you make sure you transfer it over to yourselves. Any quick questions on this present use value program? It's a big.
Perhaps I didn't answer this, but what is the process for, because in an earlier slide it said they must have a plan and follow up on the plan.
Mhm.
What's the process for following up on? Is it the forester inspect?
Yeah, great question. You have to have a plan to be in the program and you have to follow the plan. To follow the plan has to be filed with the county tax assessor. And the county tax assessor is supposed to check on that every 8 years. And they actually send paperwork out to audit it and say, hey, is your plan up to date? Update your plan every 10 years. And if the plan called for anything that said, oh, you have to do a timber harvest is the main single requirement. If they're called for a timber harvest and you haven't done it, then they'll say, well, you have to do one now. And they'll give you some time to do it. But if you say, oh, I really don't want to do it, then you'd have to get out of the program and pay back taxes at that point in time. But it's up to the county tax assessor to assess the problem, assess the program.
And do you get to pick who harvests on your property? Like you have the control to bring in?
Yes, very important.
cutters or
Yeah.
stewards?
You don't give up any property rights at all. Yeah, it's a voluntary program. You keep all your long-term property rights. Yeah. And you have total control over who's going to harvest it, who the forester is going to do the work for you, oversee it for you. All that stuff is the landowner's decision. Yeah, they keep total control over it.
If you had a development, let's say you have 300 acres and 50 of them are pretty steep and all that,
Mhm.
could you create an LLC that just for that 50 acres? and-
Yes, you could. Like if someone owned property and part of it was in forest and part of it's developed, they could create a separate LLC for the undeveloped forest part of it. And that part that's undeveloped could have a separate ownership and could qualify for the forestry present use value program.
They wouldn't necessarily have to do that, though. You could still keep it all under one ownership, and the forestry plan would only apply to the forested portion, and the rest of it just wouldn't get the tax savings.
Would you still need a
So
survey?
would
to
that qualify
delineate?
though for the development, for the
Yeah.
LLC though, because the primary business would be. for the
Yeah, you
development.
would have to separate in that case.
Yeah.
Right. But if it was just one
They didn't
one
use
LLC that owned everything, and the plan can be written to only specify a
Yes.
portion of the total property. It doesn't
Yeah.
have to be the
Yeah.
whole property.
Okay.
Yeah, for those of you online, maybe couldn't hear that. Yeah, if you have a property that's partly developed and partly undeveloped, if the whole property is owned by an entity that qualifies as being able to declare forestry for its main business, then you could have a plan written. And the forest plan will specify what parts of the property are in forest and what are not in forest, and what should count. And it's only the forested part that counts, would get the tax break. Only the acres that are forested would get that tax break. Developed acres wouldn't get that tax break. But if the ownership of the property has other primary business interests, then they couldn't qualify unless they separated out that separate part of the property that had a different ownership that did have forestry as primary use for that.
I have a question about the forested part, like what level of improvements can be applied to that? You know, because if you have this big old forest, part of its beauty is, you know, you can draw people to it for tourism. Can you put up yurts? Can you put up cabins? You know, it doesn't have to be completely undeveloped.
You can have trails, you can't have structures in it. If it has structures in it, any structures do not count as forestry. Or you can have trails,
Mhm.
and their recreational trails are fine. They can still do timber harvesting on recreational trails, but they can't do it around structures. So basically, every structure is supposed to have at least an acre around that structure kind of carved out as not being part of the forest things. So, yeah.
What if it has access very close to city water or sewer? that an issue?
No. No,
Because they can still
yeah, it
can't-
doesn't matter where the property is, any property can qualify, it's at least 20 acres of forest. So another thing is the PUV transfer process. You may be involved in land transfers, whether you're still a buyer or a seller on this. If the property is currently in present use value from the current owner, the buyer has the option of continuing the property in the PUV program and keeping those major property tax savings and not having to wait the usual either 4 years of owning it, or if they have to live on the property, they can start. But even if you live in the property, you have to wait until January 1st, because it's based on a whole tax year. But if you buy the property in the middle of the year, and it's already in the PUV, you can just keep it in seamlessly right from that date and never have to pay the higher taxes on it. So when a land transfer involves property that's in PUV, a couple things must happen. The buyer, within 60 days of closing, has to file an official application for, in this case, continuation of PUV program. And the form is AV5. You can find it online. You have to fill out the form saying that, yes, I want to keep it in the forestry present use value program. And the other part of that is the new buyer of the property has to accept liability for the back taxes. So if they do something that takes it out of compliance with the present use value program, they don't have a plan or don't follow the plan, and they're audited by the county, then they would be responsible for the back taxes. And that's the key thing that a lot of people aren't aware of at the transfer. And there actually should be a second document, second bullet point there. There actually is an affidavit that you're supposed to have filled out at closing. And this is primarily to protect the seller so that if the buyer takes it out, they don't try and pin the back taxes on the seller of the property. The seller should get in a document saying, the buyer signs saying, yes, I'm going to keep it in PUV and I'm going to assume liability for the back taxes. That way, if the buyer of the property doesn't fill out the application, doesn't properly transfer it over, it's on them. The seller then is not involved. If the property is going to be taken out of PUV by the buyer, that should be negotiated at time of sale. Who's paying the back taxes? And then, of course, once you take it out of PUV, you also have to pay the full taxes going forward on the property. So that's something that should be negotiated. But is oftentimes I've talked to realtors who weren't aware of this. I've talked to lawyers who are doing the closing and have no idea about this. I've talked to lawyers who think you have to take the property out of PUV for selling it. Not true. You have the option of keeping it in. It usually is a win-win because the seller doesn't have to pay back taxes and the buyer can keep the major tax breaks on things going if they're willing to keep it in the program there. So again, if you do want to take it out at the time of transfer, then you have to pay, someone has to pay the back taxes on it. 3 years of back tax savings. So that's a really important point there.
When on that, if it's not going to transfer and it's going to come out, usually when the paralegals call the tax office to get the tax numbers to prepare the HUD for the closing statement, the tax office is going to flag it as being forestry use. And they're going to tell them that the 3 years of back taxes are due. So when you review the HUD, if you're expecting to transfer, you see a high number, just talk to the attorney and let them know. But normally the seller is going to pay those if it doesn't transfer based upon how we write our contracts and the forms that we use.
So is that something that, like, if it gets missed, is that a title search type of thing?
It's not
Like,
a title search thing, it's just a paralegal mistake if it gets messed
paralegal
up.
mistake.
Because they didn't calculate the tax proration or the back taxes that were due, right? Because this is a tax deferment,
Yeah.
right? And so at the time of sale, deferments on taxes have to be caught up by the seller.
So you said the seller, so if there was not a negotiation in place with that and the buyer was planning on keeping it but missed the 60-day period, would that fall back to the seller's responsibility?
So if they've signed that affidavit, it's going to be on the buyer. If they didn't sign that affidavit because the county doesn't require it, Transylvania County is notorious for this, they don't ever check if you've done it, then it could go back on the seller to pay that because the buyer.
Which theoretically could come back on the listing.
Which would
or
come
not.
back on.
I guess that was my
Yes.
question about paralegal, is like, if, you know,
Yeah.
if we miss it, it was paralegal's
Yeah, right.
mistake, is that come back on
Well,
title
that's
insurance, is that
So
come
it could
back
go back
on
on
us?
us.
Yeah, so that's
Yeah.
again, get those of you online that maybe couldn't hear that conversation, that there are some technicalities that come up here, like when you do that land transfer, you sell property, the county is supposed to check on whether it's in the PUV program, if there are past back taxes due, and hopefully flag that for the lawyers doing the closing documents. But again, county tax assessors do not uniformly enforce this. Sometimes there's no mention of that in a lot of rural counties. A lot of times the closing attorneys are not aware of this at all either. And no one deals with this legally in the transaction process. And then it becomes a bit of a gray area as to who is responsible for the back taxes if it then goes out of the program. If the seller doesn't keep it in the program or forgets to file the paperwork in time, who gets, and that's why you should have that affidavit signed, especially if you're the seller's agent. So they have said, okay, we're not liable for it. The buyer's liable for it now. And it's on them
So
to
is there a
protect their
date
client,
for
they're a
these?
seller.
Will we can check for these? Because, you know, I deal with inherited properties
Yeah.
sometimes, you know, where they don't know what grandma did.
Right.
You know,
And that's where it's all in county public records. If you go on to the county records, county GIS websites, pull up the property record, it should say on there deferment. If there's any significant deferred value on taxes up there.
Right, but
On the tax bills, it should say that to the tax bills. All property records tell you if it's in the PUD program or not. And that should make you the first step, make you aware if the property's in there, and then you have to deal with that.
So basically check all large pieces of land for that guy.
Yeah, 20 acres or more of forest, it's a good chance it's already in the program.
and what you're saying as well with like inherited properties or it's been in the family forever, you quite often have found they don't have the land.
Yeah.
And in order to get that, you're not gonna be able to get it without permission of the seller or the heirs. They won't just give it to you, which is
Yeah.
totally weird. But they can call and then they'll most likely email it to the seller, or they can have that prepared for you there, but they will not just give it to you.
Give it in writing, you ask.
No, no, they'll need to talk to them.
No, but you know what I mean, like, just get it in writing.
Yeah,
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely true with inherited properties. The heirs may not know that their parents had the property in this program or had a plan for it, and the plan long lost. But the county tax assessor should have a plan on file. So if you
Okay.
find out it's in the present use paper, and they're supposed to have a plan on file, the seller, who the current owner of the property, can request that file from the county tax assessors, but not just anyone can do it. It has to be some legal owner of the property can request that file and get that plan. And if you have a transfer of property, you also often need to get a new plan done. One, because the plan might be more than 10 years old. It's supposed to be updated every 10 years, but it's often not done in some counties, not enforced very strictly, some places. But a new owner coming in, it'll flag that. They probably will need a new plan. And the plan, if you have an old plan, you have to have it transferred to your name and updated too. So you may need a new plan as well going through that property.
Where do you get the plan?
A registered forester. So I can provide it for you. Any other registered forester can write a plan that's approved for you there. North Carolina Forest Service can also do simple plans for people if they want. Yep, lots of options.
One other thing on that slide, real quick for us. Talk to your attorneys that you work with that are gonna be part of the transaction early on when you get ready to make an offer. They have boilerplate exhibits you can attach that specify whether that offer is gonna include the transfer or not. And that way, you're not surprised, your sellers aren't surprised, or your buyers aren't surprised later on down the road. I use one that's a very simple one that the seller and buyers agree that the property is gonna transfer, and that they're gonna sign the affidavit of continued use at closing. It's a very, one-page addendum that any attorney can draft out. But it just eliminates any confusion about who's gonna have to pay what when they get to closing.
Well, it's in the commercial land.
There's a commercial form, but I don't know that it goes into the detail
It
of.
doesn't have the detail, but it does say it's
All of
staying with the buyer or the seller. Whether,
Yeah.
you know what I'm talking about?
I know what you're talking about, but I can't remember what it says specifically. I remember it wasn't
It's
super
not-
detailed,
not
and so I
super
just go to my attorneys and have them
Yeah.
give me an exhibit to put in the offer, that way everybody's got it very clearly defined.
Do you have that like attached to your listings with this type of property?
No, normally whenever there's an offer that comes in, if the other broker hasn't mentioned it, then we'll have a discussion about it there and counter with that form attached or whatever.
Yeah, definitely a good thing to discuss with the lawyer during the closing and clients, buyers and sellers. A couple other notes on the PUD program. There also is an agricultural PUD program. If you have at least 10 acres under agricultural production, you're making at least $1,000 a year in revenue for at least the past 3 years. There's also a horticulture one. If you have like apple orchards or something, you have to have at least 5 acres in production, again, making at least $1,000 per year for at least 3 years. Those are out of my expertise, but there are similar programs. You can have multiple you can have forestry use and agricultural use and horticultural use and just regular full use on all the same property. They're all compatible with each other there. Again, the programs are enforced by the county tax assessors. So, and it does vary from county to county how strictly they enforce it. So it does help to call them and ask them about things on that. And they're supposed to audit every every property in the program every 8 years to make sure that they have a plan, they're following the plan, or if it's agriculture or horticulture, they actually want to see tax receipts showing that you actually are producing agricultural products on the property. You can't just have a pasture that you have to look at, but don't actually have cows in or aren't haying it or doing something to make money off it. It has to actually be a use, you do an economic use of the property you're changing for it. There are a couple other options. In addition to the forestry present use, there actually is a wildlife option where you can manage the property for wildlife and get the same tax break. There's a 100-acre maximum to the most basic one, and you have to have some kind of important wildlife habitat, and stream sides do qualify, and rock outcrops. Those are the most common ones that qualify for that. You can get more acres in if you're willing to actively manage the property for wildlife, but then you have to do active management, creating wildlife habitat, doing things to increase wildlife access to food, water, or shelter, which means you're building ponds or putting out food for planting food for those kind of things can be done. Also, is another option. The North Carolina Forest Service is a great source of helping this too. They do, of course, do wildfire suppression. They also can do controlled prescribed burns on property. It can't even be for free if a client wants to do that to reduce wildfire risk. They can do some forestry consultations. They can write a very basic timber management plan telling you when you should harvest your timber if you want that done. And they also oversee all water quality issues for timber harvesting in the project. It's all part of their mission there. So I want to go into cost share programs. There's a lot of forest and improvement work that can be done to improve forests. Controlling invasive species is number one. If you have invasive species, if you don't do anything, they will get worse. But you can do some work to improve forests by controlling invasive species. And they can get funding to do this, at least partial funding. You can also thin overly dense stands, which will benefit the growth. The trees will grow faster, benefit oaks. You can benefit wildlife, opening things up. Overall diversity, really open up a forest, create a different structure that's really needed for wildlife. And cleaning out, most talking about thinning out the understory. It's a very dense, thick understory in the forest around here, and it really benefits them from clearing them out. Helps the residual trees grow faster, benefits wildlife, benefits oaks a lot. And you're creating a different habitat type for wildlife just needed. A more open habitat for wildlife is something that's greatly needed around here. So there's funding to encourage folks to do this. The main program is the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and forestry is underneath agriculture. And the NRCS is the Natural Resources Conservation Service. They have this environmental quality incentives program. They're full of acronyms. But again, you have to have a plan to qualify for this. But you can get cost share funding. It usually pays in the mountains, it's around half the cost of the average cost. So it varies from property to property, but generally around half the cost for controlling invasive plants, doing forest and improvement, those thinnings to kind of improve the forest for oak, or to create wildlife habitat, thinning the forest for wildlife so birds can fly through easier and those things there. You can also get this for agricultural practices. It is a federal program. There's some red tape you got to apply. It's not quick and easy, but it is definitely possible to do if you want to spend some time filling out some paperwork. You can get some money to do that. And it's better to do, if you want to just do invasive control, they usually won't fund just invasive control. You have to do invasive control and some other forest and improvement work. Then you're much more likely to get the funding. It is competitive funding for this. There's no limit on the acreage size. It could be any acreage size here. You can apply if anyone owns forest. Usually the more acres, the better chance of qualifying, but anyone can apply for this money. It's tax money. And the Forest Service has a similar program called the Forest Development Program that's just for forestry. They pay a little bit of lower rate, somewhere around 30 to 50%. It's easier to apply for. Deadlines in May coming up. You could apply for that and get funding for doing a lot of the same things to the State Forest Service. And you have to talk to them, kind of the local Forest Service people, and they can set you up for doing that program as well.
Did you say, is there a minimum acreage for these two programs?
Not for the federal one. And I don't think there is for the FDP one either. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. So, but again, usually the bigger acreages are more likely to qualify for it. But if you have just an acre or two, it's maybe hard to qualify. But if we have a kind of 10 acres and got funding, no problem. So, yeah.
That's good if you walk into a forest and you see multiple rows everywhere and bittersweet.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good to know.
I'll talk about timber sale quickly here. It's really important. Number one thing is if you're having a timber sale, hire a forester. Don't just call up the local mill, the local logger, they're going to do the high grade. They're going to come in and just cut the valuable trees and have it overseen by a forester to make sure it's sustainable, make sure you get paid a fair price for your timber, and make sure that it's done properly. and they don't mess up the water quality because you're liable for water quality. That's the state's requirement to follow water quality regulations. So the forester will be the agent for the landowner, working with the logger to make sure it's done right, make sure they get a fair price. Again, you only have one chance in your lifetime, oftentimes every 30, 40 years to sell timber. So if you're going to do it once, do it right. And the other thing is, even if you're paying a forester to do the timber sale, you're still going to make more profit in the end. Here's just one example. This is from North Carolina State University. You know, someone was offered $20,000 for the 20 acres of timber. They didn't know what it was worth. So fortunately, they called the forester up, and the forester went there and said, well, it's actually worth $40,000. Timber buyers are trying to get as much timber as they can, as cheaply as they can off, and that's just their job. And the forester's job is independent foresters working for the landowner, making sure they get paid a fair price and that it's done right. So this timber, you know, and that gives you some idea of timber values. If you have mature timber, should be worth at least $1,000 an acre, hopefully 2,000. If it's really good hardwoods, maybe 3 or more. It's possible, but even after paying the forester's fee, you're going to make more money because you're going to get a better price for your timber. These are all just things, you know, have a contract, hire a forester, just basic common sense stuff. Other thing with timber sales, again, I get calls all the time. I want to do a timber sale. I go look at the property. I'm like, well, sorry, you don't have any timber here. A tree needs to be at least 16 inches in diameter to have significant value. That's a tree basically you can't wrap your arms around. Like if you're a big guy, you can probably wrap around 16 inches. That's the size of tree you have to have significant value. So it has to be a big tree, and you have to have 5 or 10 acres or more of those trees to have a viable timber harvest. It's not, you only want to cut a few trees here and there. No, you have to hire an arborist and pay to get that done. You have to have a significant volume, hundreds of trees that are big to sell, to make it sell. And timber markets are notoriously volatile. They change, you know, on the weather and the season and all kinds of factors, demands, ranges, and what happens in Asia and China affects timber markets here, because a lot of timber here actually gets shipped to China or other places in Asia. So other major issue is access. People say, oh yeah, I want a timber sale, some really big trees. And you go there and the property is, you know, vertical and rocky, and there's no way a logger can work that. So a lot of times where the biggest trees are, the steepest slopes, and because the reason they're still there is because the loggers couldn't get them 50 or 100 years ago, and they still can't get them. So access is a major issue in the mountains for things, and cost of logging are high here too. And it's really hard to find good loggers now too. It's a tough job, but you should have a plan. You should have a forester who's marking which trees to cut and which trees to leave. The key thing for a forester is not what are you cutting, it's what are you leaving, or what's going to grow in place of them. Make sure you have a regeneration plan, has to be part of that timber harvesting. And find a reputable buyer and a good logger who can do a good job and do it well and enforce the contract for things. You can get trained loggers. You can tell them what time they can, is the performance period when they have to be done by. They have to follow a plan, protect residual trees that are left, follow BMPs, or best management practices, requirements for water quality. If they do something that messes up the water quality, the landowner can be liable for that. So make sure they're following these requirements to protect water quality. Right to suspend logging. If something happens in the contract, you can say, oh, you got to stop for a while as we figure this out. Proof of insurance from the logger. And this is a key one, get a performance deposit from the logger. And this is part of every contract I write. I always do a timber sale. The logger has to give me a couple $1,000s, which I hold in escrow while they're doing their job. If they mess up and damage some trees they weren't supposed to cut, or mess the water quality up and they got to fix it, well, if they won't fix it, I've got the money. I'll pay it. I'll take their money and I'll fix it for them. So you have to have that performance deposit to keep some leverage on the logger to make sure if they aren't doing it well, they fix it and it is done well afterwards. The client is not left with damaged trees that they didn't get compensated for, isn't left with damaged water quality or eroding roads. Is a major problem as well. Water quality is big. I'll just have this real quick. Another option for selling is carbon markets. People can sell their timber to carbon markets. It's not a real good option for small landowners yet. There was this market called the NCX up there that had just a 1-year commitment. You could just agree not to harvest trees for 1 year and get paid for not harvesting for 1 year. It was easy to get into. It was no cost to get into. It was done by remote satellite assessment of forest. Technology has really come a long way. It's really impressive, but unfortunately they lost their certification. So that market is currently shut down, at least till fall. They're trying to figure it out and get it recertified and back online. That was the easiest one. The other two that are still active is this finite or core carbon, or the forest carbon works. This 40-acre minimum for these programs, and they're a 40-year contract. You have to agree to either reduce your timber harvesting or not harvest trees for 40 years to sell your carbon. It has to be, you know, on the landscape for a long time. So there are some options open out there. You can contact these organizations and talk about the options there, but 40 years is a long time. And who knows what 40 years with climate change and carbon markets are rapidly evolving. You know, there are people that are investing literally billions of dollars in this industry to try and sell these carbon credits at all the big companies that are, you know, polluting and creating. I want to be able to buy these offsets to show they're not polluting. But it's long-term stuff. It's major commitments.
So they're bundling tax credits, basically.
No, these are not taxes. These are straight up payments. They'll pay you a certain number of dollars per acre. It's been anywhere I've seen it. You have to, again, have some pretty big trees because the size of the tree costs the amount of carbon. If you've got some big trees on your property and lots of big trees, you can sell the carbon and sell by that how many tons of carbon are on the property. I've seen payments anywhere from, you know, a couple dollars an acre per year to maybe $15, $20 per acre per year if you have very mature forests. And the carbon markets are incredibly volatile. So don't quote me on those prices. They change. At one point it was $20 a ton and sometimes it's $5 a ton what they'll pay for the carbon. So
Do they lock in a long-term rate, do you know?
it depends. I don't know with the longer term ones. The 1 year term would lock in a price for 1 year. And most of these things do lock in a price for at least fairly long term. But yeah, it's again, the details get very challenging here. So I can't answer all the details on that. It's a very complex program and they're rapidly evolving. If you have a ton of acres, if you own like thousands of acres, then there are good chances to get involved in the bigger markets. There actually is in California has an actual regulated market in California that's required for California companies that are polluting, that they have to have these carbon offsets and they'll buy them out there for a higher price. But that's only for large landowners, meaning a couple thousand acres. So it's kind of the Wild West out there for carbon markets. Haven't found a simple one. Nature Conservancy is working on one with the American Forest Foundation that's not available in North Carolina yet. It's only a 10 or 20 year commitment, but that may be here in a year or so. So that's it. That's mine. If you take a picture of that slide there, I have cards and the tables here too if you want cards. If you have questions, and I'll see if I can get through the questions online. I think chat questions coming up as well. So. I know I talk fast, but I want to cover a lot of things there.
Yeah.
Again, get this, move this up here so you can see.